In his midterm budget speech for 2022, Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana challenged the South African Revenue Service to collect even more revenue. SARS collections have increased to 1.682 billion rand this year. It's up 84 billion rand from the estimations in the February budget. SARS Commissioner Edward Kieswetter joins us now for more on that. So you've been able to collect revenue above target, Commissioner. How have you made that possible? What has enabled this position that you find yourselves in?
I think there are two dimensions, Kathy. The first is when the estimate is originally penciled in and the minister announces it, it's based on certain economic assumptions. When those assumptions change, and it can change for the positive or the negative, then the October midterm and again February next year allows him the opportunity to adjust it. So what has changed? Since February, we have seen a better than expected performance in the financial sector, as well as in the manufacturing sector. And we are actually seeing a bit of slowdown in the mining sector. But collectively, that has given us some revenue boost, specifically in the corporate taxes, but also other taxes. I can share with you that from the financial services sector, that makes up just more than 41% of our revenue. So if that does well, then we do well. But then I also have to draw attention to the focused efforts of rebuilding SARS is producing what we call a compliance dividend. What that means is just, not all taxpayers pay willingly, not all taxpayers declare honestly, and not all taxpayers are necessarily not free of criminal offense. And so the work of SARS to focus on each of these areas of work is what produces the revenue between what we would have collected had SARS done nothing and what we finally collect. So for the first 6 months, I can share with you that 92.5 billion of the revenue that we reported is in fact directly linked to SARS effort.
When we look at just how SARS is performing domestically, I think that there's certainly changes in the capacity and therefore in the ability, as you're saying, to go after tax evaders, whether they want to be found or not. Let's talk about the situation when it comes to those that are breaking the foreign exchange controls, because it also is a big issue that will affect questions around South Africa potentially being grey-listed.
So remember, the foreign exchange is largely within the domain of the Reserve Bank. But where SARS does come in and is affected is when importers or clearing agencies, when they manipulate their values in two ways. Firstly, when they buy capital goods or equipment overseas, they go to the Reserve Bank to get clearance for an advance payment. And we have seen instances where, for example, an entity may apply for 100 million rands worth of equipment orders and get permission to transfer 100 million offshore. Then when the customs declaration comes back, when the goods actually delivers, you may see only 18 million declared. And so clearly the question has to be asked, what explains the 20 million difference? So it can either be a false declaration, which means you've undervalued the goods coming in and therefore try and fiddle with your customs and VAT duties, or you have overstated the original value of the order, in which case it would be a financial flow that is illicit. So that would be a huge area of reconciliation where we continuously work with the Reserve Bank to make sure that we can reconcile those flows. But let me share with you one or two other areas of risk for us. Using artificial intelligence and data access, we have this year been able to prevent the outflow of 27.5 billion rands of impermissible refunds. In other words, those are refunds that taxpayers were not actually entitled to. Now, in some cases, that may just be negligence or a honest error, but in many cases, it is because of fraudulent disclosures, people overstating income or overstating their VAT claims would then be able to draw it. We've also found instances where vendors put in VAT claims, but they have no intention to actually trade. And so 27.5 billion of the revenue we reported is just from that. Another area was state capture, and we were able to recover 4.8 billion rands worth of taxes, which we believe was lost due to fraudulent tender awards, irregular tender awards with SOEs like Eskom, Transnet, and SAPS. And our ability to claw that back has put 4.8 billion. And so I can carry on. We've also had 57 successful convictions from cases we've handed over to the NPA. We follow up, 832,000 instances of outstanding debt, which requires phone calls, engagement with taxpayers, issuing final demands, issuing civil judgments. So if we add up the work that SARS does, that's the 92 billion that we report.
Commissioner, there is a view that the Revenue Service is doing better at perhaps holding some of the smaller players accountable for non-payment of tax versus your bigger companies that, of course, would have muscle to also fight you in court, dispute the matters that you bring before them with lawyers. Talk to us about issues of capacity within SARS and how you're dealing specifically with that issue.
We still are way under where we need to be, but we are obviously subject to the allocations by National Treasury. But the claim that we only go after little guys and not the big guys is completely misplaced and without evidence. Obviously, it's easier to resolve an outstanding matter with a standard taxpayer, one who just has a simple salary and has a deduction, a payroll deduction. It's a lot easier, and so by volume, we would do many more of those. But we have reestablished the large business center, for example, and we have seen a significant improvement in compliance from the mid-80s to 90% of compliance, and we've seen a steady increase year on year on compliance revenue that we have collected. I've shared with you now that we are busy with 18 projects. Now, let me tell you what that means. 18 projects, including 222 cases of state capture related. We've been able to raise assessments of over 12 billion and collected almost 5 billion from that. Included in there would be 24 entities that we are pursuing for tax crime and 34 individuals that we are currently investigating with the potential of charging criminally with the help of the NPA. We've recently announced a bust of a well-known tobacco syndicate. That took 9 people 3 years working through 60 terabytes of data to try and get to the bottom of that. So complex cases takes longer, and the results obviously are more significant when we announce them. So whilst we go after many little guys, as you call them, with a few hundred or a few thousand there, every time a big taxpayer, a large business, or a wealthy individual, or a syndicated crime is busted. The cigarette one, for example, was a 3 billion rand potential under-declaration. So you can see that SARS has no interest. In fact, if anything, we have a greater interest to go after the bigger and more complex guys. There's no interest for us to only chase little people and to let the more complex matters get away.
When it comes to the high net worth individuals, of course, I think it was the Davis Commission that had raised concerns in particular about how high net worth individuals actually hide part of their wealth and therefore get away with paying less revenue than what they should. Is SARS doing a better job now of being able to track down some of these individuals?
So you would have heard me say, Kathy, that wealthy people and companies have the means to structure their affairs in more complicated ways, both onshore and offshore. You would also have heard me say that wealthy people, they mask their income, and the bulk of their income actually does not come from regular salaries like ordinary people. In fact, they get dividend income, they sell and buy shares and listed shares or private companies, so they have capital gains, they have interest income from investments. So the true nature of their wealth is actually not in their income statement, but rather in their balance sheet. And so increasingly we have now expanded our scope. We're also working with unexplained wealth orders to formulate that for the law. We've reestablished a dedicated capacity to deal with that. So slowly we are beginning to see the needle move on that as well. Initially, it takes time to lay down the foundation, to upskill these units, to capacitate them. But as we see in the large business and international segment, we will also in the next year, 2 years, begin to see the momentum gaining. It's a flywheel effect, and more of these wealthy individuals will have to answer to any instance of non-compliance.
Edward Kieswetter is the SARS Commissioner. We'll leave it there for tonight.